Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Big Generator by the band Yes.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So as you might tell and as you might have told from yesterday's video, I am pretty sick. I do not feel good. I feel very disconnected from my own body. Yet I have to make these videos because it's part of the dedication that I put on this channel. So if I sound a bit off today, that is why. But without further ado, here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So a quick introduction to reviewing Yes on this channel. I already know most of their discography, and the ones that I don't know and never listened to are the ones which are generally regarded as being the worst albums. Now that is to say, you people might discuss about that and say other different things, but that's what I found throughout the years. Now I don't know if I am feeling unlucky that this is their first album that we're reviewing on this channel, but at the same time I'm kind of happy because we're gonna review the debut by Yes in just 4 days in the 100th episode. So much like yesterday's video about A Momentary Lapse of Reason by Pink Floyd, this album is also an 80s album by a prominent 70s prog band. Of course, Yes are most known today for creations like Fragile and Close to the Edge and Relayer and others, but these albums that came out in the 80s were quite different from what they created back then. So Big Generator came right after 19125. Now that album basically was the launching point of Yes into popular conception in the 80s. It had some really nice singles from it. The most well known is probably Owner of a Lonely Heart, and this album tried to continue with its path. Now the major difference between 19125 and Big Generator are the creative directions. So while the first of the two was basically directed mostly creatively by Trevor Rabin, this one came into conflict with both Trevor Rabin and the returning John Anderson, because on the last album John Anderson wasn't really a part of the creative team and he wasn't, making the songs. He kind of came along to record his own vocals by the end of the recordings, but this album was basically a dilemma between Trevor Rabin and John Anderson. And Rabin himself tried to push this album forward to be in the more 80s side of things, sounding more like most of the popular music back in the 80s, while John Anderson was more pushing towards making things that sounded like what they made in the 70s. Now, we got an 80s album. This is nowhere near what they created back in the 70s. It doesn't sound anyway the same, and honestly that's a bit of a bummer because I would have loved getting another late 70s album by Yes. Now this album falls in a way similar to yesterday's album, in which it opens up with a song called Rhythm of Love, which is a very good progressive pop song, and it really does make you feel as if you're entering something which is both progressive and pop at the same time. That's going to be amazing, but at the same time it just doesn't do that, and we are greeted by very basic songs later onwards, and honestly I don't think there is a lot of good really progressive tracks on here. If I had to choose another track which would define itself as progressive, I'd probably have to go with I'm Running. And I have to say that I'm pretty surprised because I was expecting this album to sound kinda cringy. After all, it has 3 songs that contain the word love in their title, but as it so happens, although there is a very stark split in creative direction on here, the album overall is pretty fine, but you can definitely feel that it doesn't know in which way it's trying to go. But honestly, objectively, I have to say that if I were myself discovering this album back in the 80s, compared to everything that was going on at the time, this album is definitely a banger. And going over and seeing reviews about this album, I saw that people were basically, split into two groups. There's this one group which looks at this subjectively, basically comparing this album to 70s Yes, which is of course not what you want to do with an album like this, because it doesn't sound anything like what they created in Close to the Edge and Fragile. As I said before, this album is really different in many ways, and of course there are those people who say that this album, well, objectively at least, is pretty good, and personally myself, I think it's fine. I think it's a fine album. As I said, if I were to discover this amongst all the 80s tracks back in the day, I would say that this album is pretty fine, and thus I enjoyed it, but it's nowhere near being great. But if I had to compare both albums, being 19125 and this album, I'd have to say that the first one is definitely better. It has a better direction. It sounds more like 80s music, and that's fine because it's not so split on it. It's just what it is. But honestly, both of these albums, being good and all, they're not anything I would want to listen to again in any time soon. So when it comes to the cover of this album, I actually see that it takes a very stark page out of the cover of the last album, being 9125, but as I see it, this cover is actually better looking by a bit. Much like an album that came out in the 80s, the 3 of a Perfect Pair by King Crimson, this one also goes with simple shapes on this really stark yellow background, and I think that it's lovely, and I love the way that it's all geometrically pleasing, and I like this cover all the more by that. And I think one of the reasons that I actually like this cover has to fall down to the colors themselves, because I've seen that there's another version of this cover being, if I believe, a light blue in the background and some sort of purple on the Yes logo, and that I completely did not like. I think it ruined the entire aesthetic of the cover. So yes, I think that the colors themselves make this one pop out and stay memorable. And another point which connected me to this cover specifically, I think that this cover would be the closest representation to what I try to create on my channel. So what I'm basically saying is, if you look at the graphics on my channel or my Patreon, you can see that I work with simple shapes and simple colors, not using a lot at the time, and I think this cover really hinders towards that, so that's another reason why I like it quite a bit. But when it comes to the rating of this album, this one gets an objective 6 out of 10. If you put it next to Close to the Edge, this one gets a -1. It's obvious. But I guess that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be reviewing Pictures at an Exhibition, not by ELP, rather by Voyager IV. If you know it already, cool. If you don't, stay tuned for tomorrow. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Maybe less sick, hopefully. We'll see tomorrow. Bye, guys.